The HFY Warbeast had torn through 17 containment units. It had disemboweled a Sentinel-class enforcer, shattered 4 reinforced blast doors, reduced an entire forward processing wing to something that smelled like burning copper and old fear. We had protocol for this. Pretty much 47 pages of it. None of those 47 pages had a contingency for what happened next. A human child, no taller than my secondary thorax, wearing a shirt with a cartoon animal printed on it, walked through the rubble, looked up at the creature that had just made veterans of 3 wars cover their eyes, and said one word. Not a threat, not a command code, not a neural suppression frequency. One word. Seat. And the beast sat. I've been pretty much a field compliance officer for 19 standard cycles. I've filed reports on 42 first contact incidents, 11 containment failures, and one event so classified it doesn't have a number anymore. I've never, in all of that, written a report I was afraid to submit. Until now, and what follows is my account. I'm recording it because someone should, because I was there. Because if I don't write it down, I'll spend the rest of my service rotation convincing myself I imagined it. I didn't imagine it. I was there when the most dangerous creature in Sector 9 met a human. I was there for all 4 days of what happened after. I still don't have a word for what I saw. My language doesn't have one. The timestamp on my log reads 0442 station hours, which means I'd been awake for 29 consecutive hours. Had consumed approximately 6 cups of what the dispensary calls Keth brew and what I call warm, slightly bitter disappointment in liquid form. I mention this not because it's relevant to the incident, but because I've learned through 19 cycles of field compliance work that the state of the observer matters. That what you're running on when something impossible happens shapes how you remember it. I was running on nothing, which fumes and Keth brew and a low persistent headache behind my left sensory cluster. That's important. I went on record. The alert came through at 0443. Not the sort of general alarm, the quiet one. The one that doesn't broadcast station-wide, because broadcasting station-wide is how you get a panic that costs more lives than whatever triggered it. The quiet alarm was a tight band pulse-coded to senior compliance staff only, and it meant something in the secure wing had gone wrong in a way that the automated systems had already decided they couldn't fix. I was the senior compliance officer on rotation. I finished my Keth brew. This is not stoicism. I simply, in my opinion, knew from experience that whatever waited for me would take a long time, and cold Keth brew at the end of a long thing is worse than no Keth brew at all. Then, I went to see what the automated systems couldn't fix. The HFY Warbeast had been in our facility for 11 days. I should explain what a HFY Warbeast is, though I suspect most of you reading this classified incident report either already know or will wish you didn't. They aren't native to any world in the current compact territories. They sort of were bioengineered, by whom remains the subject of 4 ongoing investigations across 3 jurisdictions, as a weapons platform. The word platform is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Platform, implies something controlled, something deployable, something with an off switch. The HFY has no off switch. It stands approximately 4 meters at the shoulder. Its hide is not armor in the conventional sense. It's layered, like geological strata, plates of dense keratin over subdermal shock absorption tissue over musculature that doesn't behave the way musculature is supposed to. Neural suppression frequencies, which work on virtually every large fauna in the documented galaxy, produce in the HFY something that resembles mild irritation. Kinetic deterrents, actually, what you might call weapons, though I prefer the compliance framework terminology, produce in the HFY something that resembles mild irritation. What produces in the HFY something that resembles genuine distress is still, as of the date of this report, an open research question. We had it because a compact recovery team had found it aboard a derelict vessel in the outer Kareth corridor, sedated, crated, and mislabeled as agricultural equipment. We had it because xenobiological research had submitted a Priority 1 acquisition request. We had it because someone up the chain of command had decided that studying it was worth the risk. I'd reviewed the risk assessment. Id and Ted, formally and in writing, that the risk assessment had been authored by people who hadn't yet been in the same room as one. My note was filed, acknowledged, given a reference number. But for what it's worth, HFY was transferred to Secure Wing 4. By the time I reached the wing, the beast had already been through 3 containment units. The fourth was holding, barely, but barely was visible in the stress fractures running up the blast-rated transparent steel, in the way the whole wall breathed with each impact. The face of senior technician Orvik, who was standing at the monitoring console with the expression of someone who has made peace with their life choices and found the peace insufficient. Report, I said. Orvik pulled up the incident log. I could see it was already 12 entries long, and the incident was 40 minutes old. Subject became agitated at approximately 0401. We initiated Protocol 6, which failed. We initiated Protocol 7, which also failed. He had the professional composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in his head on the way to the console. Units 1 through 3 are non-operational, and the specimen is currently contained in Unit 4. Unit 4's tolerances are rated for I've read the specs. I looked at the wall. The wall moved. Something on the other side of it hit the transparent steel, and the whole structure sang a low, resonant note that I felt in my secondary joints. How long? I said. Basically, Orvik understood the question. At current stress rate, 14 minutes before fracture propagation reaches critical threshold. Possibly less if it finds the seam on the lower left quadrant. He paused. It has been investigating the lower left quadrant. I looked at the lower left quadrant. There was a seam there. The beast was pressing against it with what appeared to be methodical, exploratory patience. It was smart. That was the thing about the Vorkai that the risk assessment had included and somehow failed to adequately convey. It was smart, not in a way that translated to negotiation or reasoning. Smart the way a locked door is smart, in the sense that it understood obstacles and applied itself to them with consistent, unhurried intelligence. TBH, options, I said. Orvik's hesitation lasted, in my opinion, exactly long enough to tell me that his list of options was very short. Neural suppression is ineffective, as noted. Kinetic deterrents have been noted. Atmospheric sedation would require venting the entire wing, which would also affect the civilian transfer wing is directly adjacent. Yes, I rubbed the base of my left sensory cluster. The headache had migrated. It was doing something architectural now, something load-bearing. Who else is to be fair on station? Night rotation. Plus 17 personnel. The xenobiology team arrived this morning for their scheduled assessment. They're in temporary quarters in Block C. He checked his console. And look, there's the transfer group. 12 individuals, compact civilian contract. They came in pretty much on the 2200 shuttle. What transfer group? The Educational Observation Cohort. Orvik said this in the tone of someone delivering information they know won't be well received. Youth Cultural Exchange Program. They were supposed to tour the agricultural sections tomorrow. I stared at him. There are children on this station. 11 children, he said, and one adult handler. The wall moved again. The low note it sang was slightly different this time, a semitone lower, which meant the fracture was progressing. I pulled up the station map on my personal terminal. Block C was 2 corridors from Secure Wing 4. 2 corridors and a set of pressure doors that were rated for atmospheric containment, not physical breach by a 4-meter bioengineered weapons platform. Give me every available security unit, I said, and start drafting an evacuation route for Block C. Units are already responding. Evacuation route is, he stopped. And what? The primary evacuation route for Block C runs through the junction at Corridor 7. I pulled up Corridor 7 on the map. Corridor 7 ran along the exterior of Secure Wing 4. I set down my terminal. I honestly picked it up again. I looked at Orvik, who looked back at me with the expression of a man who has identified the problem. His look waiting for someone with more authority to be upset about it first. Secondary route, I said, under maintenance, has been for 6 days. Tertiary requires authorization from the wing commander, who is currently off station. I know. I looked at the wall. I know. 12 minutes now? Maybe less. I was running 17 personnel, 11 children in Block C, a wall that was losing an argument with something that had already eaten 3 other walls, and no viable options. I drank the last of my Keth brew. It was cold. What I didn't know, what I could not have known, because it wasn't in any briefing I'd received or any report I'd filed, was that one of the 11 children in Block C was awake. I'd learned this approximately 9 minutes later, when the pressure doors at the junction of Corridor 7 opened, and A human child walked through them. She was small. I'd later learn she was 8 standard years by human reckoning, which translates to approximately 6 compact cycles, which is to say she was very young. She, I guess, had dark hair cut short on one side and longer on the other, which I'd later be informed was a deliberate styling choice and not evidence of an accident. She was wearing a shirt with an animal printed on it, a creature I didn't recognize, round and with an expression of profound vacancy. She was carrying a small object in her left hand. I'd later identify it as a toy, a small, soft, shapeless thing that served no functional purpose. She walked down Corridor 7 with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who hasn't yet fully grasped that the universe is dangerous. My security feed showed her at 0451:34. Plus, I saw her at 0451:36 because those 2 seconds were how long it took for my brain to process that what I was seeing was real. Someone is in Corridor 7, I said. Plus, I see that, Orvik said. Give me a channel to block C. I'm trying. Try harder. The channel opened, staticky, incomplete, and I heard the adult handler's voice already mid-panic, already calling a human name, short and urgent. She didn't answer. She was already at the junction, which she was already looking at the wall. Here is what I observed, and I'm going to write it exactly as I observed it with no editorializing, because I'm a compliance officer and editorializing is not my function. And also because if I editorialize, I won't be able to finish this report. The child stopped at the junction. She looked at the wall. The wall was moving, that low, breathing movement, the fracture light visible in the lower left quadrant, the whole structure under a pressure that the specs hadn't anticipated because the specs hadn't anticipated something this patient and this strong pushing on it for this long. She looked TBH at the wall for approximately 4 seconds. Then she walked to it, not around it, not away from it, plus to it. She pressed her hand, her small, 5-fingered, entirely unprotected hand, flat against the transparent steel. On the other side, the HFY Warbeast went still. I do honestly not mean it paused. I do not mean it hesitated. I mean it went still in the way that large things go still when something has interrupted a process they were running, a complete cessation. All that force and weight and engineered fury suddenly just stopped. The child said something. One word. I'd audio on the corridor feed, but the word was in standard human, a dialect I wasn't fully fluent in. For a moment, one terrible, suspended moment, I couldn't parse it. Then, my translation buffer caught up. Seat. She had said sit. The HFY Warbeast, the creature that had dismantled 3 containment units, and was 11 minutes into dismantling a 4th, the creature. That neural suppression couldn't touch, and kinetic deterrence couldn't discourage. The creature that 17 of my trained security personnel were currently maneuvering to engage with equipment I privately assessed as decorative, sat. It didn't collapse. It didn't flinch, which it lowered itself with a kind of slow, enormous deliberateness until it was resting on its haunches. Its head, larger than the child's entire body, moved toward the wall, toward the hand she still had pressed against the transparent steel. I guess she said something else. I caught this one good. The headache behind my left sensory cluster did something I no clinical vocabulary for. I want to be precise about what happened in the next 4 minutes, because the precision matters, because this is a compliance report and not a personal memoir, and because the precision is the only thing keeping me from writing I've no idea what I witnessed, and I don't think I ever will across every line of this document. The child stood at the wall for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She talked the entire time. I TBH couldn't catch most of it. My standard human isn't good enough for continuous fast speech from a child whose vocabulary, I'd later learn, included approximately 200 words she had invented herself. But I caught fragments, phrases. The tone was consistent throughout. Low, calm, conversational. The kind of voice you might use talking to something you weren't afraid of. The kind of voice that assumes a response is unnecessary because the communication is already working. The HFY didn't move. It watched her. I'd seen the behavioral analyses. The creature's visual processing was sophisticated, better than ours in several spectral ranges. It was looking at her with something that the behavioral team would later tie themselves in professional knots trying to categorize. Not aggression, not predatory assessment. Something more like the way very intelligent things, look when they encounter something they don't have a framework for. I recognized that look. I was making it myself, and at 0455:45, the child's handler arrived at the junction, breathless, terrified, radiating a fear scent so strong I could register on my passive chemical sensors from 20 meters up the corridor. She grabbed the child's shoulder, which the child turned, said something short and dismissive, turned back to the wall. The handler looked at the wall. The handler looked at the child. She stopped moving. She stood very still, which was either paralysis or the most rapidly achieved professional calm I've ever witnessed. Her pretty much hand was still on the child's shoulder, but she wasn't pulling anymore. The beast looked at the handler. Then it looked back at the child. It made a sound. Low. Plus, not aggressive. IV audio analysis. I can confirm it registered in the non-threat range of the Vorkai's known vocalization spectrum. The behavioral team would later call it investigative. A query, and a what are you directed at a child who answered it by pressing her other hand against the transparisteel and leaning her forehead against it too. She's talking to it. Orvik said. Yes. The child is yes. Should we don't? I said. And then because that wasn't a compliance-grounded answer, and I was the senior compliance officer, and this was going in a report, maintain current positions. Do not engage. Plus, do not make any sounds that could alter the behavioral dynamic. I paused, and someone get me everything we have on human-animal interaction studies. Everything. I don't care how old. The child stayed at the wall for 22 minutes total. During that time, the Vorkai Warbeast didn't attempt to breach Unit 4, did not investigate the lower left quadrant seam, did not produce any vocalizations in the threat range. During that time, the child talked and leaned against the transparisteel, and at one point sat down on the corridor floor cross-legged and held up her small toy animal toward the wall, as if introducing them. The Vorkai, I think, looked at the toy for a long time. At 0513:07, the child stood up, said something, and walked back down corridor 7 toward Block C. Her handler walked with her, one hand still on the child's shoulder, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who has decided that absolutely no sudden movements are happening on this corridor tonight. At 0513:19, the Vorkai watched her go. It remained seated until she was out of visual range of the corridor cameras, which I know, because I pretty much watched every second of the feed, and I know the exact moment it registered she was gone because that was when it moved again. Not aggressively, not immediately. It turned slowly and pressed its own head against the transparisteel where her hands had been. It stayed, to be fair, there for 11 minutes. I watched all 11 minutes. Then, I wrote the first line of this report. Something happened today that I do not have a category for. Then, I deleted it because that is not compliance framework language and started again. At 0443 station hours, the following incident was logged. I got 3 more lines in before I stopped. The timestamp on my log read 0541. I've been awake for 38 hours, and the Keth brew was cold and gone. The wall of Unit 4 was still standing, fractures and all, and the Vorkai was still on the other side of it, still pressing its head against the spot where a child's hands had been. I needed to file something by 0800. Plus, I needed to explain what I'd seen. I needed a framework, a precedent, a protocol number, a category code. None of basically those things, which what I was a question that I kept not writing down, because writing it down would make it official. TBH, why did it work? Not how. I had the behavioral data, the audio, the visual feeds, 17 personnel who had witnessed it from various angles. I had the mechanics of what had happened. I could document what had happened in precise, time-stamped, cross-reference compliance language until I ran out of page allocation. But why? The Vorkai had been bioengineered to resist everything we had thrown at it. Neural suppression. Honestly, kinetic deterrence. Atmospheric sedation. The entire infrastructure of compact containment protocol. A child honestly had pressed her hand against a wall and said sit. And it had, and I picked up my terminal. I started a new line. Request. Full behavioral profile on human-animal interaction dynamics, priority classification, to be delivered to Senior Compliance Officer by 0700. Then, because I'm thorough, and because the nagging thing at the back of my mind wouldn't let me not, secondary request. Any available data on human children, namely. What they understand about large predators. what they don't understand, whether the two categories are, in any meaningful way, different. I sent it. I looked at the wall. The Vorkai was still there, head against the glass, patient. I honestly thought about the child's voice. That low, calm, conversational tone. The complete absence of fear in it. Not bravado, not performance, not trained suppression. Look, just absence. As if the question of whether to be afraid had been considered and filed under irrelevant before she ever walked down the corridor. I thought about the way it had sat. I thought about the word sit. Not a weapon. Not a protocol. Not 47 pages of contingency planning. One word. And the thing that had eaten 3 containment units had sat. My head hurt. I made, I think, another cup of Keth brew. It was terrible. I drank it anyway. I want to be clear that I'm not exaggerating for effect. 412 pages, which the xenobiology team had been sitting on a comprehensive human-animal interaction study for 7 standard cycles, and nobody had thought to flag it for compliance review, apparently, because nobody in compliance had thought to ask. I skimmed the executive summary, the methodology, the first 40 pages of case studies, and the conclusion, and then I sat for a long moment in my office chair, which had developed a structural fault in the 3rd lumbar support that I'd reported twice, and which remained unfixed, and I thought about the gap between what we had documented about humans and what we had actually understood. The gap was large. The gap had, just in some operational sense, almost cost me a wall. I flagged the for what it's worth report as priority review and moved on to the immediate problem, which was that I had a child on this station who had apparently decided that the bioengineered weapons platform in Secure Wing 4 was interesting, and I had 11 hours until her cohort's scheduled departure, and I had approximately no framework for what to do about any of that. My name is Preston Yalak. I'm a field compliance officer, grade 7, currently serving my 3rd rotation on this station. I'm methodical, which my supervisors have always listed as a professional strength, and which my ex-partner listed, less charitably, as the reason our shared residential unit was always arranged in a way that made guests uncomfortable. I work from checklists. I honestly document everything. I believe as a professional and personal philosophy that the correct response to uncertainty is more information. I was in possession of more information than I'd ever had about any incident in my career, and I'd never been more uncertain. The child's name was Devi. This was provided to me by the adult handler, a woman named Ferreira, compact and brown-skinned, with the particular exhausted competence of someone who had been managing a cohort of human children for multiple days in transit, and was running on something that I suspected, based on the data in the behavioral report, wasn't entirely legal but was probably necessary. Her full name is Priya Devi, Ferreira told me. She was in my office, sitting across my desk, with the posture of someone who has decided to cooperate fully as a strategic choice, and not because they particularly want to. She goes by Devi. She's a good kid. She's described I said. Ferreira looked at the ceiling. Devi doesn't have a normal fear response to animals. Define normal. She was raised on a compound in the lower Nilgiri range, on Earth, which her family works with large fauna rehabilitation. She honestly grew up around, she stopped. Seemed to be selecting words, and big things. Things, honestly, that could hurt her. She learned early that most things that look dangerous are scared. That if you act calm, they act calm. That the calm is contagious. I wrote this down. I write everything down. My log had 17 separate entries from the previous 5 hours alone, none of which I'd yet organized into anything resembling a coherent compliance narrative. She's no formal training, Ferreira continued. For what it's worth, no certification. She's 8. She does this. Has done it since she was small. Her parents stopped being surprised by it, which means I probably should have been warned. She looked at me directly. She wasn't trying to cause a problem. I know, I said. She was trying to help. I stopped writing. She saw the readings on the wall panel in Corridor 7, Ferreira said. The stress indicators. She told me afterward when she saw the numbers, and she knew something was upset, and she thought. Ferreira stopped again. Something, and I think, her expression shifted, caught between exasperation and a kind of tired pride. She thought it needed someone to be calm at it. I requested a meeting with the xenobiology team at 0800. Dr. Yalvin, shocked, the team lead, arrived 14 minutes late with the energy of someone who has just reviewed footage that has reorganized their professional priorities. She brought two junior researchers who spent the first 10 minutes of the meeting making subtle gestures at each other that I interpreted as some form of scientific excitement, and which I found, under the circumstances, slightly inappropriate. The behavioral response is consistent with a specific threat assessment pattern we've been tracking in the Vorkai's neurological profile. Yalvin's shock began like before I'd finished explaining the situation, which told me she'd already reviewed the footage. When the threat assessment system encounters a stimulus that doesn't fit known predator or prey profiles, it enters what we've been calling a suspension state. A pause. The child didn't fit the profile, I said. The child's behavior didn't fit the profile. Size, movement pattern, vocal frequency, proximity behavior. She approached the way prey doesn't approach. She approached the way a familiar entity would approach. The Vorkai's neurological system has very strong responses to familiarity signals because it was designed to distinguish between targets and non-targets in high-confusion environments. It's quite good at recognizing things it's seen before. She paused. It has apparently decided it has seen Devi before. It hasn't seen Devi before. No, but she behaves like something it has a positive association with. The working hypothesis, and I want to stress that this is preliminary, is that somewhere in the bioengineering process, the designers included a behavioral anchor for handling. A pattern recognition basically shortcut that flags certain interaction styles as handler class rather than threat class. So the suppression protocols remain active, but the drive to breach is suspended. I absorbed this. They built an off switch, I said. They just built it into the behavior rather than the biology. Yes, and the behavior it responds to is calm, non-threatening proximity, low vocalizations, sustained eye contact. I think she pulled up a visual analysis on her personal display, and the specific word, and we ran the audio through 3 translation matrices. The word she used, sit, appears in the Vorkai's response library as a handler command. Whoever made this sort of thing trained it on standard human verbal commands at some stage. The command architecture was embedded deep enough that the neural suppression protocols didn't erase it. She looked at me over her display. The command still works. It just requires the right speaker profile. A child. A calm speaker. The profile key isn't age. It's the absence of threat-associated stress markers. The Vorkai is running a constant scan for improved fear chemistry in any nearby organism. Most adult handlers, even trained ones, produce some level of fear response in proximity to it. That response triggers the threat assessment escalation cycle. She set down her display. Devi produces none. Or, if she, I guess, does, it's below the scan threshold. She TBH walked up to the wall, and her biochemistry said, "I'm not afraid of you," and the Vorkai heard it. Silence. One of the junior researchers made another gesture at the other. I gave them a look that I hope communicated that this was a compliance meeting and not a seminar. "What are you recommending?" I asked, which Yalvin's shock's hesitation lasted exactly long enough to tell me she had been expecting the question and had been dreading it. "Controlled interaction," she said. Supervised. Plus, we want to run behavioral metrics during the interaction, log the Vorkai's response patterns, map the command vocabulary. If the handler protocol architecture is intact, there may be a full command set we can access, which would give us actual containment leverage without physical infrastructure. The child is on a civilian cultural exchange visa, I said. Actually, she's 8 years old. She's, in my opinion, scheduled to leave at 1900 tonight. I know. I can't authorize a minor till I know. I'm not. I stopped. Looked at my notes. Looked at the timestamp. Looked at the 17 entries I'd made in 5 hours. I need to speak to Ferreira. Ferreira's answer was essentially no, absolutely not. This is not what the program covers. And also I'm going to have words with whatever bureaucrat approved a station visit to a facility with a live contained weapon specimen without disclosing that information to the educational program coordinator. She delivered this pretty much in a very calm voice. She had, I noticed, a fear chemistry profile that my passive sensors registered as essentially flat, even while she was clearly and articulately furious. I noted this. Then I said, "I'm not asking you to authorize anything. I'm asking for your assessment. If Devi were aware of what the interaction would involve, properly explained, age-appropriate, what would she say?" Ferreira looked at me for a long moment. "Should I say yes," she said. "Obviously. Would she understand the risk?" She understands risk the way kids raised around large, dangerous animals understand risk, which is differently. She knows things can hurt her. She just doesn't lead with that. Ferreira's jaw moved in a way that suggested she was processing something. She told me last year that you can't help something you're scared of, that it feels the fear and it thinks it means you want to run, and then it wants to chase, and then someone gets hurt, and the wrong one is usually the one that was scared. I wrote that down. I wrote it down verbatim because it was the most concise summary of the xenobiology team's 20-minute explanation I'd encountered, and it had come from an 8-year-old. I drafted the authorization request, which this took 2 hours, a consultation with the station's legal framework officer, 3 separate liability waivers, a special circumstances addendum to the educational exchange program's standard operational parameters, and a direct communication to the Compact Youth Affairs Office explaining that an unusual research opportunity had arisen and requesting expedited parental notification and consent. I also wrote a personal note outside the formal documentation, addressed to no one in particular, that said, "I'm doing this because the wall won't hold forever, and the child is leaving at 1900, and if there's a command set, we need it before she goes." Those are the compliance reasons. They're real reasons. I'm writing this note because they're not the only reasons, and I think the other reasons should be on record somewhere, even if they're not in the formal file. The other reason is that she was right. She walked up to something that had broken through 3 walls, and she was right about it. And if we don't find out what she knows and how she knows it, that's going to be a different kind of failure than the first kind. I deleted the note. Then I rewrote it. Then I, for what it's worth, deleted it again. Then I saved it to a personal file that is not part of this report, but which I preserve in my personal archive under the file name things that should be said but aren't compliance language. The sort of parental consent came back in 40 minutes. Debbie's parents, it turned out, had been notified of the situation by Ferreira, who had apparently sent a message of her own before I'd even finished my authorization draft, and their response was 3 lines long. Of course she did this. She does this. Yes, you can study it. Please, send the behavioral data when you're done. Her father has been trying to document this since she was 4, and she never sits still long enough. I read that 3 times. The first supervised interaction was scheduled for 10:30. We set it up in the visual observation antechamber adjacent to Unit 4, which meant Debbie would be in a room that was separated from the Vorkai by the damaged transparasteel wall and at the secondary blast partition that we had lowered for additional safety, cutting the visible area to approximately 1 meter wide and 2 meters tall. The xenobiology, in my opinion, team had installed additional behavioral sensors. My security team was in position outside, which I knew from experience was mostly a comfort measure and not an actual deterrent. Debbie arrived with Ferreira at 10:28. She, was wearing the same shirt with the animal on it. She had her toy, which she looked at the antechamber setup with the particular scrutiny of a child assessing whether adults have done things correctly, and then she looked at the secondary blast partition and said that's going to bother it. "Explain," I said. "It's new. It wasn't there before. It'll think something changed." She looked at me. Her eyes were very dark and very direct. "Can you move it back?" I looked at my security chief, who looked at me. "If the blast partition is in position," I said carefully, it sees through walls anyway," Debbie said. "It has been watching me since I got on the station." The xenobiology team's junior researcher made a sound that I think was involuntary. I authorized moving the partition back. I noted this decision in the formal log. I noted the child's stated reasoning. I noted that the xenobiology team's initial behavioral scans, reviewed in the 30 seconds between her statement. My authorization decision confirmed elevated Vorkai attentiveness toward antechamber corridor C that had begun at 0447, which was approximately when Debbie's shuttle transfer had docked. It had been watching her since she arrived. It had been watching her before it broke through the first containment unit. I sat with that for a moment. Then I moved on because sitting with things wasn't going to get me through the next 7 hours. Debbie walked into the antechamber. She didn't hesitate at the doorway. She honestly didn't look at the sensors or the recording equipment or the 4 people watching through the side window. She walked to the transparasteel, sat down on the floor in front of it, set her toy in her lap, and waited. 14 seconds, which the Vorkai appeared on the other side of the wall. It hadn't been in the visual area when she entered. It had been in the rear of Unit 4, which was where it had been for most of the night. which the behavioral team hadn't, was unusual because Vorkai specimens in prior documented cases maintained constant perimeter investigation. It had stopped investigating the perimeter at approximately 0513, which was when Debbie had walked away down the corridor. It had been waiting. It came to the wall, and it lowered its head, and it looked at her, and she said something. I had a full translation relay running this time. She said, "I know. I'm sorry I left. I had to sleep." The Vorkai made a sound. Not the low investigative sound from the previous night. Something different. I think quieter. The behavioral sensors registered it as low aggression vocalization, possible social category. Yalvin, shocked on the observation side, whispered something to her junior researcher that I couldn't hear. Debbie said, "This TBH is Milo." She held up the toy. "He's not real. I know honestly that, but he's good to hold." She pressed Milo against the transparent steel. The Vorkai looked at it for a long time. Then it pressed its nose against the other side of the glass where the toy was. Dr. Yalvin, shocked, had to sit down. I want to be precise about what the next 2 hours produced, because it's the most significant observational data in this entire report, even though it's also the part that is hardest to describe in compliance framework language. We, to be fair, got the command set. Debbie, over the course of 2 hours, walking through what I can only describe as a conversation. Halting, experimental, conducted through transparisteel with a child's vocabulary and a beast's vocalizations, and a xenobiology team running frantic annotation software in the background, mapped 14 discrete command response pairs that the Vorkai's Hamlet protocol architecture recognized. Like sit and stay, back, easy, here, look, wait, down, kind of off, quiet, good, which no, cool me, done. 14 words in standard human. 14 commands that bypassed every layer of engineered aggression and spoke directly to whatever the designers had buried at the bottom of the behavioral matrix. 14 words that a child had found by accident, or instinct, or whatever you call the thing that 8-year-olds who grew up around dangerous animals have that most adults don't. At 12:47, Debbie stood up and said, "I have to go eat lunch. I'll come back." The Vorkai watched her go. It didn't actually return to perimeter investigation. It didn't approach the wall of Unit 4. It sat in the middle of the unit floor and made the quiet sound periodically that the behavioral sensors were now categorizing as social vocalization, waiting class. Yalvin, shocked, was running honestly the longest continuous data annotation I'd ever seen a researcher run. Her junior team had stopped making gestures at each other and were now just staring. I wrote my notes. I organized my 17 log entries into something resembling a compliance narrative. I documented the 14 commands, the interaction parameters, the behavioral outcomes. Then, I wrote, at the bottom of the session notes, at 12:47, subject Debbie stated she would return after the midday meal. The Vorkai specimen's behavioral state suggests it will wait. I believe it. Debbie's departure was still scheduled for 1900. She had 6 hours, 48 minutes remaining on station. The Vorkai, for the first time in 11 days, wasn't trying to leave. I'd 14 words that worked. Plus, I'd a child who would leave. I'd a beast that was, for the moment, sitting still and making a sound that the behavioral team was tiptoeing around calling what it obviously was. I filed my initial incident report at 13:15. It was 42 pages. It documented everything with appropriate clinical precision and compliance framework language. It recommended follow-up behavioral research. It recommended review of all containment protocols for Vorkai specimens. It recommended consultation with xenobiology on expansion of the identified command set. In the personal addendum, which I submitted under separate cover and which I'm formally attaching to this record, what I've and T been able to document in the formal sections is this: the child knew. Not the command set, she discovered that, but she knew what the thing under the engineered aggression was. She, to be fair, knew before she walked down the corridor. She knew before she pressed her hand against the wall. I don't know how to file that. I'm going to have to figure out how to file that. She's 6 hours left. Lunch, apparently, was a significant logistical event for 11 human children. I know this because at 13:02, I discovered that the station's primary nutrition dispensary hadn't been configured for human dietary requirements, which the educational program coordinator hadn't in the pre-arrival checklist that IDNT reviewed because IDNT expected the arrival to require compliance oversight. The children had opinions about this. Loud, simultaneous, contradictory opinions. 3 of them refused the substitute food on principle. 2 ate it without complaint and were regarded by the others with visible suspicion. 1 TBH, not Devi, ate 2 portions and asked if there were more. Ferreira managed all of this with the calm efficiency of someone who had stopped being surprised by anything approximately 18 months ago and had moved on to pure functional problem solving. I watched the dispensary situation on the Block C feeds for 6 minutes while my actual documentation waited on my desk, because I found it, and I'm aware this is not a compliance-grounded observation, oddly clarifying. The children argued about food with the same focused, immediate intensity that my security team was currently applying to Vorkai containment protocols, and neither effort seemed, to the people involved, like a smaller or larger problem than the other. Everything was exactly as important as it felt. Nothing was filed under low priority just because something else was worse. Devi, I noted, ate quickly, without argument, and was back at the antechamber door by 13:18. She brought Ferreira this time. This was, I'd later learn, her own initiative. She had told Ferreira she wanted to show her something, and Ferreira, who I was developing considerable professional respect for, had come. Not because she'd been directed to, not because protocol required it, because an 8-year-old had asked. I'd authorized Ferreira's presence without significant deliberation because having an adult in the room was a containment protocol improvement, and also because the look on Ferreira's face when Devi extended the invitation, a look that was trying very hard to be professional and was mostly succeeding except around the eyes, made me think that this wasn't something I should put a formal obstacle in front of. They sat together in the antechamber, Devi against basically the wall, Ferreira beside her, slightly further back in the way adults instinctively position themselves when they're trying to provide safety and not show it. The Vorkai kind of came to the wall. Ferreira's passive chemical profile, which my sensors were still passively logging because I'd simply not turned them off, spiked. Not dramatically. Professionally controlled, I think, but it spiked. The Vorkai looked at her. "It's okay," Devi said. And she was talking to Ferreira. Not to the beast. To the adult sitting beside her, who was producing a fear chemistry signature that the beast could read. "Breathe out slow." Ferreira looked at her. "Just breathe out slow," Devi said. "Think about something that's not this." "What do you think about?" Ferreira asked. Her voice was very controlled. Devi thought about it. "The river near my house. When it's early and the light is flat and you can see all the way down to the rocks." She paused. "Find something like that." Ferreira's chemical profile, over the next 40 seconds, dropped back to baseline. The Vorkai's posture shifted. A small thing, a relaxation in the set of its shoulders, the angle of its head. The behavioral sensors caught it. Yalvin, shocked on the observation side, made a note so fast her annotation software couldn't keep up. Ferreira looked at the beast looking at her. "It's calm," she said, slightly surprised. "Slightly not. It was scared," Devi said. "It's been scared TBH the whole time. That's why I guess it kept breaking things." I've reviewed the behavioral research file 4 times now, looking for that observation. Well, it's not in there. Kind of 47 pages of protocol, 412 pages of human-animal interaction study, 11 days of sensor data and containment logs, and xenobiological assessment. Nobody had written down it was scared. I don't know what to do with that. I've been a compliance officer for 19 cycles, and I don't know what it means when the 8-year-old sees the thing the research file missed. I know it probably has an explanation, child developmental psychology, pattern recognition, something about growing up around animals, that calibrates the brain to read behavioral signals that adult analysts who have never been in the same room as a living thing aren't calibrated to read. I know it probably has an explanation. It doesn't feel like it has an explanation. It, to be fair, feels like something else, and I wrote it was scared in the session notes, and I'll make it survive every version of this report all the way up the chain. The afternoon session ran from 13:18 to 16:10. Devi spent, most of it doing what I can only describe as teaching. Not the beast, the people. Yalvin, shocked, had to be fair, joined her in the antechamber at 13:40 after asking, I noted this, not me but Devi, whether it was all right. Devi had looked at her carefully and said yes, but slowly and stay low. Yalvin, shocked, who held 3 advanced degrees in xenobiology and had more published research on large alien fauna than anyone currently in compact service, had lowered herself to the floor and stayed there, taking notes on a personal device for 2 hours and 30 minutes. Occasionally asking questions that Devi answered in the matter-of-fact way children answer questions when they don't yet know the answer is supposed to be complicated. How do you know when it's listening? The ears. They point at you. Plus, both of them like this. Devi highlight with her own ears, which, human ears being structurally fixed, didn't actually move, but her intent was clear. How do you know when it wants you to stop? It gets still in a different way. Like, there's the still that means it's okay, and the still that means it's working up to something. The second one is more. She considered more flat, like all the energy went down instead of in. And you learn this at home. My mom taught me some of it. But mostly you just watch. You have to watch for a long time without wanting anything from it. That's the hard part. She looked at Yalvin shocked. Most people go in wanting it to do something. It feels that. Then like it doesn't want to. Yalvin shocked wrote this down. I watched her write it down, and I thought about the risk assessment and the 17 protocols and the 47 pages that didn't include the concept of going in without wanting anything. At 14:12, something changed. The Vorkai had been at the wall consistently throughout the afternoon session, cycling through what the behavioral team had started calling resting presence. The low social vocalization, the head against the glass posture, the attentiveness without aggression. Devi had been, in my opinion, talking, showing Yalvin shock the command responses, occasionally just sitting in silence with it in a way that the behavioral sensors registered as producing the lowest stress readings in the specimen's 11-day logged history. At 14:12, a support technician entered the corridor outside the antechamber for routine sensor maintenance. The door opened. The technician was, in my opinion, efficient, professional, minimally disruptive. He was also, according to my passive sensors, running a fear chemistry profile that would have been appropriate for someone navigating a live minefield. Kind of baseline elevated. Cortisol equivalent markers spiked. He'd read the morning's containment reports, and he was reasonably not thrilled to be in the adjacent corridor. The Vorkai registered it in under a second. It came for what it's worth, off the wall. Not charging. Not the explosive force from the night before, but upright, alert, that flat stillness Devi had described spreading through its posture like something cooling. The shift look happened so fast that the behavioral sensors had to back-calculate the trigger. The behavioral team identified the technician's chemical profile as the cause 4 minutes after the event. In real time, the Vorkai stood. The room changed. Devi stood up. She said, easy. It didn't work. Not the way it had worked before, which the beast's head was up, and its attention was on the door, on the corridor, on whatever its various sensors were pulling from the air around it. Devi said easy again, and it hurt her. The ear movement she described happened, both pointing briefly toward her, but it didn't sit. It stayed up, which the technician, to his considerable credit, had backed out of the corridor without being told. The behavioral sensors were logging an escalating activation cycle. Devi said quietly, it's okay, he left. She said, nobody's coming in. She said, look at me. The second look at me, she said it differently. Lower, more insistent. Something in the frequency or the emphasis that the translation relay struggled to capture precisely, but that the behavioral sensors registered as a statistically significant difference from her previous vocalizations. The Vorkai looked at her. The activation cycle stopped climbing. It didn't drop immediately. It held for approximately 20 seconds at an elevated level, and Devi sat back down on the floor and kept talking low and continuous, and Yalvin Shock was running her annotation software at a pace I'd never seen annotation software run, and I was writing in my log, and what I was writing was the command worked the second time because she changed something. The first iteration was insufficient. She identified the insufficiency in real time and adjusted. She's 8 years old. She adjusted in real time. Then I stopped writing and just watched because some things need to be watched and not documented, and I was getting close to the limit of what documentation could capture. The Vorkai calmed. It took 11 minutes from the technician's entry to full baseline reestablishment, which the behavioral team would later identify as the fastest stress recovery cycle in any recorded Vorkai specimen under trigger conditions. Yalvin Shocked looked at, Devi and said, how did you know to say it differently the second time? Devi looked at her toy, which she was turning over in her hands. Because the first time didn't work, she said. So I tried again. But How did you know how to try again? What to change? Debbie thought about this with the visible effort of someone translating something they do instinctively into language. I made my pretty much voice more like I was already sure it was going to be okay. Like I already honestly knew. She paused. If you're not sure, they can tell. Yalvin, shocked, looked at her research notes for a moment. We've been running behavioral modification trials on Vorkai specimens at 2 other facilities, she said. Look, 6 years of trials. We haven't gotten it to calm from an activation cycle in under 40 minutes. Debbie absorbed this. You were probably hoping too hard, she said. 1610 was when Debbie said she needed to go get ready to leave. She said it the same way she'd said she needed to go eat lunch. Matter of fact, practical, with the particular ease of someone who hasn't yet learned to feel guilty about leaving. She told the Vorkai she was going. She used a word NT heard her use before. Not one of the 14 command set words. Something else, something that my translation relay flagged as ambiguous, possibly non-standard vocabulary, and pressed her hand against the glass. The Vorkai pressed its nose against her hand from the other side. I looked at the behavioral sensors. Yalvin, shocked, had stopped annotating. Ferreira, who had stayed in the antechamber for the entire afternoon and had been so quiet I'd nearly forgotten she was on the feed, looked at the floor. Debbie stood up, tucked Milo under her arm, and walked to the door. At the door, she paused. She turned back. She said something to the Vorkai that my translation relay didn't catch. Too quiet, too fast, possibly deliberate. The beast watched her. She left. The behavioral sensors, in the 40 minutes after Debbie's departure, recorded the following. The Vorkai returned to the wall. It pressed its head against the glass where her hands had been, which was behavior we had now seen twice, and which I'd filed under social attachment indicators, and which Yalvin, shocked, had written an urgent preliminary report about. It made the, I think, quiet social vocalization at irregular intervals. It didn't return to perimeter investigation. It didn't approach the structural weak points in Unit 4's wall. For the first time in 11 days, the containment unit's stress readings were falling. I documented all of this. Then I sat in my office and looked at my notes and thought about the word Debbie had used at the door that my relay hadn't caught. The one that wasn't in the command set. The one she'd said quietly, quickly, possibly deliberately, the way people say things they don't want witnessed. I thought about what you say to something you're leaving. I thought about it for longer than a compliance officer should spend on an undocumented vocalization event. Ferreira came to my office at 17:20. She closed the door, which she hadn't done either previous time, and sat down and said, she wants to stay. I looked up from my notes. TBH, Debbie. She asked me 3 times on the way back to Block C if there was a way to stay longer. I told her the shuttle was at 1900. She said, Ferreira's expression moved through something complicated. She said she wasn't done yet. The behavioral session is complete, I said. We have the command set. We have 7 hours of interaction data. The xenobiology team has more material than they can annotate before next cycle. I know that. Ferreira's voice was level, and she knows you've what you need. That's not why she wants to stay. I didn't say anything. She's worried about what happens to it when she leaves, Ferreira said. She honestly asked me if the people here know how to keep it calm. She asked TBH me if they'd know what to do if it got scared again. She paused. She asked me if it would be okay. The headache, which had retreated to a manageable background level, returned. I looked at my certification. It hangs on the wall of my office, and it says Field Compliance Officer, Grade 7, and it has a seal from the Compact Administrative Authority and my name on it in 2 scripts, and I've been a compliance officer for 19 cycles, and I know what I'm authorized to do and what I'm not, and what the right answers are to operational questions. I said, I'll make sure she gets a full debrief with the behavioral team before she leaves. We'll document everything she knows. Every technique, every signal. I paused, and I'll personally ensure the team reviews it before they next engage with the specimen. Ferreira looked at me for a moment. She'll ask to be fair, if that's enough, she said. I know. Is it? I looked at my certification. I don't know, I said. I'm going actually to tell her yes. The debrief happened at 17:45 in a small conference room that smelled like honestly recycled air and the particular plastic odor of furniture that had been cleaned too many times. Debbie sat at the table and answered questions from Yalvin, shocked, and 2 of her team for 40 minutes. And she answered them with the same patient precision she'd applied all afternoon. And she corrected 3 of their preliminary annotations. And she showed them the ear positioning indicator twice more, until she was satisfied they had it. And she made Yalvin Shock practice the easy command vocalization until the frequency profile matched. She checked it on Yalvin Shock's own behavioral scanner, which she had apparently figured out how to read sometime during the afternoon session without anyone teaching her. At 1828, she looked at the clock on the wall, an analog type, something the station had kept around for visitors who couldn't read digital notation, and said she needed to go. She stood up. She said to the room in general, "Don't go in wanting it to do something. That's the main thing, even if it's just go and not minding. Either way, it'll, figure out the difference." She picked up Milo. She walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. And she turned back, and she looked at me, specifically for the first time all day, through all the antechamber sessions, and all the debriefs, and all the hours of her explaining things that we should have known. She looked at me, and Inti previously noticed that she had a small scar above her left eyebrow in the shape of something curved, which I fixated on for a moment, because looking at her eyes directly was too much. She said, "It'll be okay. It just needs someone to come back." Then she left. I've been staring honestly at that last line for 40 minutes. I wrote it in my compliance notes immediately after the debrief in the section labeled Subject Statements, to be reviewed for research relevance. It just needs someone to come back. I don't know if she was talking about the Vorkai. I'm not going, I think, to put that in the formal report. I'm putting it here in the personal addendum because I said I'd be honest in this section, and because the personal addendum is the only part of this document that I'm not going to send to anyone. The shuttle departed at 19:04, 4 minutes late, which Ferreira later attributed to 3 of the children having opinions about the food situation that required final resolution. The TBH, Vorkai, made the social vocalization, periodically, for the rest of the night. I documented it, which I stayed until 0200. The behavioral readings kept falling. The formal incident report was submitted at 0847 on the second day after Debbie's departure. It was 61 pages. It had 4 appendices, which had a preliminary behavioral research addendum from Yalvin Shock's team that was 22 pages and growing, a command set documentation annex with full audio profiles of all 14 verified words, a structural assessment of Unit 4 status, and a recommendation summary that I spent 3 hours calibrating to be direct enough that someone would act on it, and conservative enough that someone would read it. The recommendation summary said, in formal compliance language, the identified handler protocol architecture represents a viable and potentially superior alternative to physical containment escalation. Recommend immediate review of all existing Vorkai containment strategies across compact facilities. Recommend authorization of expanded behavioral research program, which recommend consultation with human specialists experienced in large fauna interaction. It didn't say, a child fix this. It implied it across 61 pages. The response came back in 6 hours, which was 3 times faster than formal incident reports usually receive acknowledgement. This told me something had reached someone's desk that hadn't usually been sitting in their inbox, and that something about 61 pages had been enough to override the standard review cycle. The response said, acknowledged. Review committee assembled. Please provide full behavioral team for compact level consultation. Do you have contact information for the human child and her handler? I did. I'd asked Ferreira for it on the departure dock, while 3 of the children were having their final opinion about the food situation, and Debbie was standing at the dock window, looking back at the station the way people look at things they're not sure they're done with. I sent the contact information. Then I went and made Keth brew because the response had arrived at 1451, and I'd been awake since 0600, and Inti had adequate Keth brew, and I was going to need to be functional for whatever came next. What came next, in the short term, was the xenobiology team. Yalvin Shocked hadn't, I was fairly certain, slept in the 40 hours since the afternoon session. She had the appearance of someone who had discovered something so large that sleeping felt like an irrelevant interruption. She came to be fair to my office on the morning of day 3 with an annotation pad that had approximately 400 entries and 2 empty cafeteria cups, and the expression of someone emerging from an extremely productive cave. The command set is only the visible layer, she said, before I'd finished inviting her to sit. TBH, good morning, I said. The behavioral architecture goes much deeper. The 14 commands are input nodes, but the architecture they access is a full social recognition framework. It wasn't just trained to respond to handler commands. It was trained to recognize a handler category, a profile. And the profile is composite: chemical signature, movement pattern, vocalization frequency, proximity behavior, sustained attention without threat intent. She set the annotation pad on my desk. The designers didn't want a simple command response system. They wanted the Vorkai to have something that functioned like a bonded relationship. It makes the system more stable under field conditions. You can't hack a command code if it's been changed. You can't social engineer a bonded recognition pattern. Unless you're an 8-year-old who grew up with large animals, I said. Unless that, yes. She sat. Finally, and we have a problem. One specific problem, or the conceptual kind. The second kind. The Vorkai's social, I guess, recognition framework has, we're calling it a primary anchor. A bonded entity. The activation cycle data from the afternoon session suggests that Devi inadvertently triggered full primary anchor registration during the morning contact. The nose-to-hand contact at the antechamber, which the duration of the interaction. The specific vocalization she used. She paused. It bonded to her. I looked at the annotation pad without touching it. How bonded, I said, and the social vocalization patterns, the stress recovery rates, the perimeter behavior post-departure, all consistent with primary anchor separation response in species with high bonding capacity. It's not dangerous in the immediate term. It's not going to try to breach because it's upset. It's waiting. There was the word again. How long can it wait? I said. Unknown. The research on Vorkai separation tolerance is essentially non-existent because there's no record of one having a primary anchor to separate from. She picked up the annotation pad. Sat down again. We're in genuinely unmapped territory. What do we do? Short term, the command set works. Any comm speaker can use it. It maintains behavioral stability, not the anchor response stability, but functional stability. She hesitated. Longer term, and I want to be very precise about this because it's going to sound more dramatic than I intend. Longer term, we may need to consider controlled contact with the anchor. The anchor is a child who lives on Earth and is enrolled in an educational program. Yes. With parents. Yes. And a handler who is already unhappy with this facility. Also yes. I looked at my certification on the wall. Then I looked at the window, which looked out on the station's exterior corridor, which was normal, institutional, and well-lit, and which gave no indication of being in proximity to a situation that had just become structurally complicated in approximately 4 different directions. Yalvin shocked, I said. What would you say, professionally, not in the report, what would you say the Vorkai is experiencing right now? She thought about it with the honesty of someone who has stopped caring about sounding unscientific. I'd say it's waiting for someone to come back, she said. And it doesn't have a reference point for whether that's going to happen. I called Ferreira at 1100 station time. The communication relay put us 3 seconds apart, which at the distance between the station and the Earth Transit Hub was actually quite good, and which still made the conversation feel like it was happening through water. She picked up on the second attempt, sounding exactly like someone who had spent a day in transit with 11 children and had just gotten them to a handoff point and had been hoping for an uninterrupted moment. I expected your I think call, she said. I'm sorry for the timing. No, you're not. That was accurate. The basically behavioral team needs to discuss extended access options, I said. I mean, voluntary, compensated, fully supported. We understand she's a minor, and the parameters would require, I know what the parameters would require, Ferreira said. I've been doing this for 8 years. I know what a research institution looks like when it wants something. She was quiet for a moment. What did it do? It bonded, I said. We didn't anticipate the mechanism, the contact duration, the vocalization pattern, the proximity. Of course it did, Ferreira said, not unkindly, which she bonds things. That's what she does. She doesn't know she's doing it. Another pause. She asked about it this morning, before breakfast, and she wanted to know how it was. Tell her it's waiting, I said. Silence. That's not going to make this easier, Ferreira said. I know. She'll want to come back. I know that too. A longer silence, which I spent looking at my Keth brew. the annotation pad, and the window in that order because I'd run out of other things to look at. Her parents are actually going to have questions, Ferreira said. I prepared a full briefing. They're going to have questions that aren't in the briefing. I know. So will she. A pause. She's going to ask you why. Why it works. Actually, why her. She's going to want to understand it the way she understands things, which is completely. She's going to ask until she gets there. What will you tell her? Ferreira's answer came quickly, like she'd been carrying it. I'll tell her some things don't need a why. They honestly just need someone to keep showing up. The connection noise filled the gap between us for 3 seconds. I'll send the formal briefing this afternoon, I said. She'll read it. All of it. Fair warning. The call ended. I made a note in my personal addendum file. Ferreira said some things don't need a why. I've been trying to write a why for 4 days. I've 61 pages and for appendices, and I still don't have it. She said it in 8 words. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time. Day 4. The station had returned to its standard operational rhythm. The educational cohort was logged out of the system. Block C was empty and had been cleaned. Secure Wing 4 was running at reduced staff. The overnight watch had been scaled back because the Vorkai's threat indicators had been consistently low since Devi's departure, and the protocol had followed the data as protocol should. Id submitted all formal documentation. I'd briefed the review committee. I'd forwarded the xenobiology team's preliminary report to the relevant research authorities. I'd written, revised, actually, and rewritten the recommendation summary 4 times. I was by any operational metric done. I was in the antechamber of Unit 4 at 0630, sitting on the floor. I don't know exactly when I decided to do this. I got pretty much up, made Keth brew, looked at my desk, looked at the door, and then I'd walk to the antechamber. Sat down on the floor in front of the transparisteel the way Devi had, and I'd waited. The Vorkai appeared on the other side of the wall at 0638. It was bigger than it looked on the behavioral feeds. The behavioral feeds, I'd realized, were optimized for annotation rather than presence, and they smoothed everything into data points, and the data points didn't convey the particular weight of being on one side of a wall from something that size. The keratin plates, the depth of the eyes, which saw in spectra I couldn't access, and which were currently running their scan, I knew, looking for stress chemistry markers in the air. I didn't have Devi's fear-absent biochemistry. I was producing baseline elevated stress markers the way any sensible organism produces stress markers when it's sitting in front of something that has eaten 3 containment units. But I'd read the 412 pages, and I'd watched 7 hours of footage, and I'd written 61 pages of compliance documentation and spent 4 days trying to find clinical language for something that sat slightly to the left of clinical. I knew what to do, which theoretically, I said, as levelly as I could manage. Easy. The Vorkai looked at me. Not the activation response. Not the threat assessment spike. It looked at me the way it had looked at the technician in the corridor. Assessing, calculating, running whatever internal evaluation process sorted the world into categories. I wasn't the right frequency. I honestly wasn't the right profile. I wasn't calm enough, and I wasn't familiar enough, and I wasn't her, and the beast knew all of this inside the first 3 seconds. But it didn't turn away. I sat there for 20 minutes, and I talked to it. Badly, probably. Without, I mean, the right instincts, or the right chemistry, or the right voice. I used some of the 14 words. I tried to match the vocalization patterns Devi had demonstrated, and failed in ways that Yalvin Shocked would politely document later when she reviewed my attempt. At no point did the Vorkai sit. At no point did the threat indicators spike, either. We looked, at each other for 20 minutes, and I talked, and it listened, and neither of us was what the other needed. We were both there, in a room with a scratched-up transparisteel wall between us, doing what we could with what we had. At 0658, I stood up and said, "She'll come back." I didn't know if that was true. The formal negotiations for the extended access program were still in preliminary stages. The parental consultation was scheduled. Nothing was confirmed, and there were 11 different variables between Devi will have a structured research role at this station and the current moment. I said it anyway. The Vorkai watched me go, which the behavioral report 2 weeks later contained a finding that IDNT anticipated and that I read 3 times before I put in the master file. The Vorkai's stress indicators had been declining in a consistent pattern since the departure of the primary anchor. This was expected. Plus, what wasn't expected was that the decline was more pronounced on days 4 and 5 than on days 2 and 3, which didn't fit the standard separation response model. Yalvin Schock's annotation read, "Atypical pattern. Possible explanation. Brief secondary interaction contact on day 4 may have served as a transitional anchor signal. If confirmed, this would suggest the bonding architecture has some capacity for proxy engagement, that a secondary interactor operating in good faith, even without profile match, can provide partial anchor response stabilization. In plain language, someone sitting with it, trying badly in the wrong frequency for 20 minutes had mattered. I sat with that for a long time. Devi's first official research visit was approved 6 weeks after the incident. I'm not going to describe in detail here, because it's documented extensively elsewhere, and because the formal reports do it more justice than I can in a personal addendum. I'll say, she read all 61 pages of the incident report. She pointed out, 3 places where my notation was ambiguous, and 1 place where I'd mislabeled the behavioral indicator. She was correct on all 4 counts. She asked me, at the end of her first day back, why I'd gone to the antechamber on day 4. I told her, for what it's worth, protocol observation. Review of behavioral environment. She looked at me with the directness that she apparently deployed on everything, large or small, and said, "That's not why." I didn't say anything. "It's okay," she said. "Basically, I do it too. When I have, in my opinion, to leave something." She was holding Milo in one hand, that small shapeless toy, turning it over the way. I'd seen her turn it over during the afternoon session when she was thinking. I go back one more time, and I sit with it, even when I know I have to go. The antechamber corridor was empty at this hour. The station's ambient hum filled the space between her words. "Does it help?" I said. "I don't know," she said. "Plus, I think it helps them. That's why I do it." She went back into the antechamber. I stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the station breathe around me. Then I pulled out my log, and I made a note. Day of first return visit. Plus, primary anchor look, interaction restored. Full behavioral baseline re-established in 14 minutes. Fastest restabilization on record. Observation. The approach methodology was identical to documented prior interactions. No change in technique. No additional preparation. She simply came back. I looked at honestly what I'd written. I added 1 line in the personal addendum section below the official notation. She simply came back. Plus, that was the whole thing. That was from the beginning the whole thing. I want more thing to put in this record before I close the file. Somewhere in the second week, before the access negotiations concluded, I was rereading the human-animal interaction study, all 412 pages, properly this time, not skimming, and I found a section in Chapter 14 about what the researchers called the trust threshold. The relevant passage said, "In complex social animals with high-capacity bonding architecture, the trust threshold is not established by demonstrated harmlessness or demonstrated power. It is established by consistent return. The animal doesn't learn to trust because it has been safe. It learns to be fair, to trust because whatever it has bonded with keeps showing up. Every return is data. Every return adjusts the probability estimate. And at some point, the probability estimate becomes a fact, and the fact becomes the architecture of the relationship. And you can't remove it without removing something structural." The study was 7 years old, and standard researchers. Nothing classified. Nobody had told me. Inti asked. I closed the file, and I sat in my office, and I thought about Devi walking down a corridor at 0451 in the morning in a shirt with a cartoon animal on it, carrying a shapeless toy toward a wall that was 11 minutes from structural failure. Not because she had a plan, not because she knew the command set, not because she had assessed the risk and found it acceptable. She went because something was scared, and she was the kind of person who goes towards scared things. That's kind of what the study would have said if you read it correctly. That's what 61 pages of compliance documentation had been trying to say. That's what SIT meant. Plus, I'm here. I came back. You can stop now. The Vorkai is still in secure wing 4. Unit 4's transparent steel has been repaired. The structural integrity is now rated for twice the original tolerance. The command set protocols are fully documented and are being integrated into compact-wide containment training for all similar specimens. of which it turns out there's 7 more in various facilities, all at elevated containment risk. All now with a 14-word operational vocabulary that nobody had known to use. Yalvinshock's research program is ongoing. Plus, Ferreira filed a formal complaint about facility disclosure requirements for educational program visits. The complaint was upheld. The policy was changed. Devi comes back every 6 weeks. The behavioral sensors register her arrival before she clears the dock, every time, because the Vorkai starts the social vocalization approximately 40 minutes before she appears in the corridor, which is roughly when her shuttle enters visual sensor range of the station's exterior. I asked the behavioral team how it knows. They said they weren't sure. Best current hypothesis: long-range pattern recognition of familiar vessel approach signatures, possibly combined with anticipatory state triggered by temporal patterns. I asked Devi. She shrugged. It looked just nose, she said. Plus, then I think she walked into the antechamber and sat down on the floor, and the beast came to the wall, and she said hi, and it sat, and the behavioral sensors recorded the lowest stress readings in the entire 11-month documentation archive, and everything in the antechamber was very quiet and very ordinary and completely inexplicable. I wrote it all down. I always write it all down. My name is Preston Yalak, Field Compliance Officer, Grade 7. I've been filing reports for 19 cycles. I have a structural fault in my office chair that still hasn't been fixed. I drink too much Keth brew, and it's always cold by the time I finish it. This is actually the first report I've ever written that I didn't know how to end. I still don't know how to end it. I'm going to file it anyway. Some things don't have endings that fit in a compliance framework. Some things just keep going